All right, so far we looked at a little bit why racism exists. We talked about many non-effective interventions in part one, things that researchers like me like to do in the lab, and at the end some mostly explicit attitude measures to see if it works or not. Then we talked in part two about some really cool successful interventions that actually change behavior in the real world, but also talked a bit about the limitations of them, right? We showed that not all of them can be successful all the time, and that there's no magic cure to this almost innate tendency in humans to be racist and prejudiced towards others. So now in part three, I want to talk about implicit bias training, often called unconscious bias training outside psychology. If you ever want to make me really mad or sad, depending on my mood, then call it unconscious bias training and call the implicit bias unconscious bias. I was like, but I taught them something different. But that just as a side note, let's talk about it, right? We started today with kind of reminding ourselves of Starbucks, and that they tried to do this intervention where they gave all their employees this anti-bias training for a week in the US because they had an incident where some white employees or one person acted racist towards two black customers. Okay, so what Starbucks did, they decided, okay, let's do an anti-bias training and check racism fixed, and then we can reopen our facilities again. And if you kind of type in unconscious bias, there's like tags, example, training, meaning, test UK, in the workplace, quiz types, super popular. Tons of TED Talks about that, how we can fight this, how we can fight that. I think last week I talked about this, the diversity training that I did that had nothing to do with unconscious bias, was called unconscious bias training. So it's a popular name, and I don't know if that's helpful or not, but we can decide that at the end of this section. So let's have a look. How do people actually, like in science, fight implicit bias, and is it successful or not? This is just a reminder. This is the slide from last year, PS 2006, Social Psychology, where we looked at these myths about unconscious bias. So there are like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 myths. And we discussed the evidence about each of them, right? The first one was, does everyone have it? In some case, I think it's fair to say that everyone has an implicit bias towards one group or the other. It seems, as we talked about a little bit in the beginning of today's session, we talked about the minimal groups, right? That even if I assign you to one group and the other, some other people to another group based on something completely random, for instance, what kind of colors you like, then you will have some animosity towards the other group and some love for your own group. These vary widely, and if you have a lot of contact with an outgroup, these biases go away. It's not that every white person has an anti-bias or an implicit bias towards a black person or vice versa. There are large individual differences. Some people don't have these biases because they live in such mixed environments. One other reason to live in South London. But that's just as a side note. But we can kind of say that's somewhat true, that most of us have some version of that one way or the other. Then we talked about implicit bias. Is it unconscious? We call it implicit bias because it's not an explicit question you answer, but it's implicit based on your performance. And these biases, while most have of them, we are also mostly aware of them. So if you do an IIT and you after would be asked to predict your own performance, you have very good insight into your performance. You know whether you were biased or not. So people are aware of these biases. So that's why we should not call them implicit, unconscious bias, but rather implicit bias. Implicit biases are not very stable over time. You will see that in a second. You can easily manipulate them so that they vary. They often change with contextual changes in our environment. So they're not super stable. There was this idea that you're basically kind of acquired it early on in your childhood, and then boom, there's nothing you can do about that. But there's very little actual evidence to support that claim. So implicit bias, actually explicit biases, your beliefs about others that you're consciously or more easily consciously aware of are much more stable than your implicit biases. Okay. Does implicit bias drive racist behavior, right? Why do we care about this implicit bias? Because it predicts behavior. It depends. Implicit bias seems to predict a certain type of behavior, and that behavior is often when our system 1 is in charge, not so much our system 2, when our more automatic processes are in charge. So for instance, if you remember in PS 2006, we have the study where we want to see what predicts interpersonal behavior from in an interaction between a white and a black person, and implicit biases were more predictive for spontaneous behavior, body language, tone, and the perception of the white person by the black person, while explicit attitudes are much more predictive of the content we're saying, so what we really want, right? Makes sense, where we have more control over it. So spontaneous behavior under stress and ambiguous, uncertain situations is better predicted by implicit attitudes, while when the opposite is true, it's more about explicit biases. So there's good reason to kind of address implicit bias because it's one source of racist behavior, for sure. And then, is implicit bias not affected by context? We talked about this a little bit. We will talk about this quite a bit in the upcoming slides. It is. It is heavily influenced by context, right? So it's not that you're have this bias and whatever happens around you. No, rather the opposite. It seems that the context really strongly biases the biases you have, so to say. But let's have a look what research has to say, how we can change that. So there's a case that most of us has it, and there's a case that this has an important impact on behavior. So how can we change it? This is one exemplary study I want to kind of highlight. This is where they basically tested in the most scientific, rigorous way, right? Remember part 1, this is really, really important that we test our interventions in a rigorous and scientific way. This is the best study that is out there, a meta-analysis on 2 different interventions that we thought of as really good at changing unconscious bias, implicit bias. Now I said it too. They call it unconscious bias as well. How dare they? Okay, so these are meta-analysis of 426 studies, found weak immediate effects on unconscious bias and weaker effects on explicit bias. A side-by-side test of 17 interventions, and this is what we look at to reduce white bias. Toward blacks, found that 8 reduced unconscious bias effects dissipated within a few days. So what kind of, how did they test that, and what kind of results do they find? This is the meta-analysis I talked about, and here, this is, I don't want to give you too much detail about it, but basically have a time 1 where you get one of these interventions, and then you get a test seeing if it's actually reduced your implicit attitudes with the IAT, right? Remember the implicit association test. Then it checks your explicit attitudes as well, and then they measure the demographics, and then you come back. I think this is after 2 to 4 days or 1 day later, right? So this is not really in a month, right? Remember the studies in part 2, months later, weeks later. No, this is tomorrow you come back. In most of the cases, okay? That's important to remember. So what type of interventions were in there? Here are some examples. Let me just move my stupid face up here. So here you see exposure to counter-stereotypical exemplars. 4 interventions were designed to reduce IAT scores through experiences with positive black exemplars and negative white exemplars. With a counter-stereotypical scenario, practicing an IAT with counter-stereotypical exemplars, shifting group boundaries through competition, shifting group affiliations under threat, okay? Or practicing an IAT with counter-stereotypical exemplars. Here's an example of a story that you could read. This is a little bit, remember when we talked about imaginary or extended contact? This is one example. So vivid counter-stereotypical scenario. Participants in this intervention read a vivid second-person story in which they are the protagonist. The participants imagines walking down a street late at night after drinking at a bar. Suddenly, a white man in his 40s assaults the participants, throws him or her into the trunk of his car and drives away. At some time, the white man opens the trunk and assaults the participant again. A young black man noticed the second assault and knocks out the wild assailant, saving the day. Okay, so that's like where it's like, okay, you should imagine that it's like a bad white exemplar and a good black exemplar. Okay, and that should shift your associations. There are more to that. Appeals to egalitarian values. This is often what like universities do. Is very easy, right? Just like to reduce. So 5 of them is by appealing deeply held egalitarian values. Think about what we did in part 1, value-based interventions. This is exactly here the idea. Priming multiculturalism to improve intergroup relations. Some endorse multiculturalism. The idea that racial, ethnic differences should be appreciated and celebrated. Experimental evidence suggests that considering multiculturalism reduces implicit racial preferences. So this is like basically, remember when we talked about the value-based interventions, this is exactly it, where it's like, oh, remember, here we in Society X, in London, in South London, we cherish multiculturalism, hence these are values we have and we should live by that, and then we try to kind of nail them in and ensure that people are really aware of them and make them guide their behavior. We have that. We will talk about this actually next week. These are intentional strategies to overcome biases, where you just say, like, I don't care what you think, I don't care what you feel. Here are some implementation intentions, very specific plans on how you can basically improve your performance on the IAT. Okay, so this is not so much about where anything changes, just like get better at the IAT, aka get less biased on the IAT. So the results show that like the basically of all of these interventions done, there's like implicit preferences are malleable, but does that change last? We tested 9 interventions, 8 real and 1 sham. To reduce, the sham one would be the one that's the control condition. To sham, we often do, we pretend that something should work, so the participants have the same expectations, but we actually don't think that this should work, or there's no good reason that this should work. In 2 studies with a total of 6,300 participants, all 9 interventions immediately reduced implicit preferences. So if I measure it and then I basically give you the intervention, I measure it again, boom, near for reduction. However, none were effective after a delay of several hours to several days. We also found that these interventions did not change explicit racial references. So basically what they do is, if I shift the context, then, and I think this is like a kind of like this idea when we come back, this is a slide actually from social psychology, but basically what these interventions do, there's for the moment when you're in the lab, they shift your preferences, okay? They shift your preference by shifting the context you're in. Suddenly you're in a context where, like in this case, right, in the examples we read out, where suddenly you as a white person are in a environment where black is good and white is bad, and it seems like that we seek or soak that in and change our preferences accordingly. So if I kind of create that context in the lab and thereafter test you, then yes, your attitudes will change. But then I bring you back a day later, hours later. Now suddenly the context is completely different. You might be in a different room, it's a different day, different things are activated in your mind, and it is gone. So this kind of reminds us often, I often think about this is like a similar point that I'm trying to make here, is that I often think like, okay, what are the lessons of these studies? And some of the lessons I think that you can learn here is really that like your implicit attitudes, they matter for your behavior, and the context and the environment you create for yourself or that you're in really shapes these implicit attitudes. Okay, so it's not so much that they don't matter because they're fleeting. No, it really matters the context, right? I think this is often when we feel like, okay, let's say I want to exercise more. It's really, really good to keep on basically surrounding you with positive hours, like with exercise videos on Instagram, on YouTube, reading articles, etc., just to keep those implicit attitudes alive that create a context that then drive your spontaneous behavior when you're stressed or when you're exhausted, and these more automatic processes take over. So I think that's a real important lesson. There's another one which I just want kind of to briefly mention here because it's important, and this is the idea that some of these anti-bias trainings actually can backfire. So this is from Gino and Kaufman, and here they kind of review the evidence, and it's like, oh, right, sending the message that biases are involuntary and widespread, beyond our control, in other words, can make people feel they're unavoidable and lead to more discrimination, not less. Okay. Let's pause here for a moment. A lot of anti-bias training starts basically by telling you, hey, everyone is racist. We all have these unconscious bias. There's nothing we can do about it. Let's see if we can kind of keep them in check and control them. So if you think about, for instance, our theory of planned behavior, what should happen is that your behavioral control immediately goes down. It's like, I have these negative attitudes. I shouldn't try to change them. There's nothing I can do. It's not my fault. So if I'm rude to my, headscarf wearing colleague, then it's not me being an asshole. It's just like these biases that I have. Right, and so Francesca, Gino, and Kaufman write further. Right, in fact, in a 2006 review of more than 700 companies, Alexandra Kalev, Frank Dobbin, and Aaron Kelly showed that after UB training, so unconscious bias training, the likelihood that black men and women would advance an organization often decreased. It is no wonder that women and people of color continue to report higher levels of unfair treatment in the work, right? So it's basically kind of like you're telling the hiring, the people in HR, look, guys, you have racial biases when you hire. There's nothing you can do about it. It's like, okay, well, then let's lean into that. So I think this is really like another kind of outrageous puzzle piece in this whole area of prejudice reduction, where we can see that even the best intended often efforts backfire and might make things worse rather than better. So it's really important to keep in mind, and I hope when you go out there, I hope that when you are in an organization, you will not make these mistakes that we outlined today in this video, but also in today's session, but rather that you do it better. Here's some recommendation. I don't want to talk too much about them. I think if you are ever wanting to do an intervention along those lines, Neil Lewis and colleagues have a really thoughtful piece, right? They kind of built on it and said, like, okay, what can we do? And thus we argue that diversity training should go beyond telling people that bias exists or creating uncomfortable experiences that are more likely to prompt defensiveness than learning. Rather, the most effective training is anti-bias training that is designed to increase awareness of bias and its lasting impact, plant seeds that inspire sustained learning, and teach skills that enable attendees to manage their biases and change their behavior. Although a dearth of consistent evidence of success had led many to conclude that training does not work, empirical research exists that can provide a blueprint for how to build a training program that does. Think about our second part. There are some really successful programs out there, and we have a responsibility as social psychologists to make sure that we use the right tactics to implement them. All right, I think that's it from my point. Here are some kind of highlights, what they highlight in their review piece. This is like, okay, challenge, be realistic about what training can accomplish, select the proper goals for the programs, deciding how to manage attendee discomfort, minimizing counterproductive effects of discussing bias, demonstrating impact. I think there are recommendations. One thing why I like this slide, and now I remember why I put it out here, it is also often, and I think I highlighted that very early on, think about affordances, right? Think about the problems we often face when we face change interventions. And one of the problems is that people might, in growth mindset intervention, right? The student might go and say, oh, maybe my brain is like a muscle. And then they go out and they meet their teacher and the teacher doesn't think so. Similar here, it's often frustrating to kind of aware of an organizational structure that might enable discriminatory practices, and then realizing that there's nothing you can do about it because the management that manages you thinks, okay, we give them an anti-bias training, so racism check, we can move on. And now they come and want to actually change something, the way we hire, the way we structure our selection committees, maybe even now they want to change whom we hire based on the criteria we outline and so forth. And there's a lot of resistance, and that can really backfire and make people really feel disillusioned and hopeless when they are trying to change something. So let's make sure that we think about organizations when we talk about and when we do anti-bias training or trainings that try to alleviate and reduce prejudice and racism in organizations.